Welcome to Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax.
Hello and welcome to Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax with Nora Devine. Nora has been a property tax attorney in private practice since 2005. She has developed a statewide practice in all jurisdictions in Illinois and represents all property classes. I'm Kevin Rosenquist, and today we're going to look at what happens when property taxes go unpaid, from interest and penalties to tax sales and redemption periods. Nora will break down how the enforcement process really works and what owners can do before it's too late. Nora, great to see you.
Thank you.
So when a property owner falls behind on taxes in Illinois, what's the first official action that the county takes?
So they mail the bill out, and then 30 days from the date of the mailing is the due date. And in the statute, sometimes they refer to this as the first penalty date. So if you don't pay the taxes by that date, then 1.5% used to accrue, which adds up, 1.5% per month adds up to like 18%, which was an extreme amount of money. So there were some studies that were done by the Cook County Treasurer, Maria Pappas, and I think also Cook County Board President, Tony Preckwinkle, and they found that this 18% onerous interest rate was disproportionately affecting the Black and brown residents of Cook County, and they sought to change it. So they reduced the penalty and interest from 1.5% per month down to 0.75% per month. So the minute you go one day beyond that penalty date, then that's when that 0.75% of the outstanding amount will accrue. And then there's no point in paying it the next day. You could basically wait until kind of the end of the month, because the next date that there will be penalties accrued would be then a month from the first penalty date. So it's not an attractive interest rate. It's 9% now. It used to be 18%, which was extremely burdensome. And you have quite a bit of time really to have them unpaid before anything really happens. But at some point, if they remain unpaid, they will go to what's called the annual sale.
Okay. And what is the annual sale?
So the annual sale is when there's private entities, private investors that come to an auction, and it's actually a reverse auction, and they have a list of properties and PIN numbers that have delinquent tax amounts on it. And what they do is they begin the bidding at the top, which is 9%. And then based on the perceived risk of owning the property, or based on the likelihood that the outstanding properties will be redeemed, is what they call it. So that's redeeming, is when somebody has a large delinquency and then they go to the county clerk and they pay the amount that's due. That would be called redeeming. So what happens is the tax buyer is looking to step into the shoes of the property owner and pay the tax on their behalf. And in exchange for paying the tax on their behalf, they get to charge a certain amount of interest. And the interest begins at 9%. And then this pool of tax buyers, they bid it down. So in your riskier jurisdictions where there's difficulty with tax enforcement proceedings, the interest rate may be higher when somebody bids on it. In your, posh neighborhoods, or, wherever, they may bid the interest rate all the way down to zero, just to take the wild chance that perhaps they might be able to secure a deed to the property somewhere down the road. But generally, when you talk to these tax buyers and these people that purchase tax certificates, they are in it for the interest. They're not really in it for the deeds anymore. So they're trying to collect a lot of unpaid property tax certificates on a lot of different properties. And then when the taxpayer finally redeems, then they get made whole for all the costs that they advanced for notices and publications and just paying the installments and so forth. So that's basically how it works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I didn't even know that was a thing. That's so wild, like to think about that. And is that, I know there's annual, scavenger, and forfeiture sales, right?
So here we normally talk about the annual sale and we talk about the scavenger sale. So the annual sale is when the property tax buyer pool thinks that there's a decent enough chance that these property taxes will be redeemed and that they will make a certain amount of interest on the tax certificate that they are agreeing to hold. There are, however, some jurisdictions in Cook County that have such terrible tax enforcement problems that they struggle to attract the tax buyers to buy the certificates in those areas because it's just perceived as high risk and that they won't actually redeem them anyway. And then unfortunately, the effective tax rates in some of these areas are such that within 5 years, the amount of taxes that are due and payable on the property will actually add up and exceed the market value of the property itself. So if you're a tax buyer, you're not necessarily looking at that as an attractive investment. So then therefore, if those remain unpaid for 2-3 years, then they go to the scavenger sale, and that's a normal auction, not a reverse auction. So the bidding starts at zero and it's like, well, who wants it? And then maybe someone will bid, $5,000 on a property that has $50,000 in outstanding taxes. And then what'll happen is they'll pay the 5,000 and everything will get wiped out with the tax deed. All the past due taxes are wiped out, even the water bill, even a mortgage, if there was one or anything like that.
Wow.
So it's controversial, like in terms of what happens, what the effect of a tax deed is. It's pretty clear though, under the law, that the mortgage is gone, the water bill's gone, say there was a demolition lien, that's gone. I think, I'm not a tax deed lawyer, so definitely want to check with somebody who's specialized in that area before relying on anything I'm saying. But I know enough about it because I've been around it enough and long enough, and I have pretty good friends that are colleagues in that specific practice area. But yeah, it's a very interesting area because in Illinois we have private entities and private citizens stepping in to pay the tax on behalf of the delinquent taxpayer. And in other jurisdictions and other states, the system doesn't work like that. And so it's more like the county running it more like a forfeiture sale, more like a foreclosure sale. But here we have private people acting as investors in the tax deed, tax sale space.
Interesting. That's really, really super interesting. So what rights does a delinquent property owner have after a sale?
Well, in Cook County is a different story than outside of Cook County, which I'm sure you're starting to learn by now after talking to me enough times about Illinois property tax.
Well, I do remember I am originally from Chicago, so I do
Yeah, I
know
know.
that Cook County can be very, very different from everywhere else for sure.
Yeah. Well, tax deed purchasers, tax certificate holders, they tell me that it's very easy to get a tax deed outside of Cook County. That, you go to court and you get the deed because you followed all the rules that are in the property tax code. Inside of Cook County, they find it very difficult to get the deed because the judges are very kind of active on behalf of the taxpayers, particularly if they're homeowners. So, they're not necessarily in it for the deeds anymore the way that they used to be because getting a deed has become a lot harder over the last few decades. So the residential property owners have a lot more rights than the commercial property owners do. There's pretty broad redemption rights available for residential taxpayers, especially if the home is owner occupied. And so you get quite a bit of time. And right now there was a case in Minnesota called Tyler versus Hennepin County that was decided by the US Supreme Court, and they invalidated the tax sale system in Minnesota because there was no mechanism whereby the equity remaining in the property could have flowed back to the taxpayer themselves. It was basically taken by the county no matter what. And we do have that situation in Illinois too. We don't have the county receiving the windfall. We have private investors receiving the windfall, but we do have a system where if there is remaining equity after the delinquent taxes are paid, the equity, if any, is not going back to the property owner. It's going to the tax buyer. So it is interesting right now because Illinois is struggling with how to modify the property tax code to make it compliant with Tyler versus Hennepin County. And I'm going to have a guest on the show in the next few months who does tax deed work, who's going to talk about the Illinois response to that Supreme Court case. But for right now, the immediate result, and we are filming this in November of 2025, we are still kind of waiting for the legislature to respond to the US Supreme Court case. And for that reason, the tax sale has been delayed because they're trying to figure out how to make it compliant with the law as it stands now.
So how does the cost of redemption work? How is that determined?
In order to figure out what you owe, because the goalposts are always moving on what you owe. You had an original delinquent amount and that was knowable and that was a certain number. But since the tax buyer stepped into your shoes and paid for the taxes on your behalf, and now they have the certificate, what's been going on since then is quite a bit of things. Number one, they've been paying the subsequent installments on your behalf, unless you beat them to it, which usually doesn't happen. Usually the minute they're known and payable, the tax buyer is picking up those subsequent installments. So the amount that you need to pay to redeem is going up because they continue to add on more installments as the installments come out. Number one. Number two, there's all kinds of statutorily required notices and fees and publication fees and things like that. So as they're going along with their tax business of investing in these tax certificates, they are hopefully usually complying with what the property tax code says in terms of you have to notify this person, you have to send certified mail to this person, you have to publish in this publication. And so there's fees associated with all of this. And as time goes on, they're tacking on these fees to the tax certificate. So the goalposts are always moving on like what it costs to redeem. And what you do is you go to the circuit court, not the circuit court clerk, you go to the county clerk's office at 118 North Clark. And there is an online way to do this, but we're still doing it in person. But you go there and you say, I need an estimate of redemption on this particular tax parcel. And then they will give you a paper called an estimate of redemption, and it will show a grand total at the bottom. And it should also have a last day to redeem printed on the face of the document. So that lets you know what's due right now and lets you know when this estimate is good to. And then you can advise the property tax payer how to pay, where to pay, what to pay, and by when do they have to pay. Because once you get beyond that last day to redeem, if the tax buyer doesn't extend it voluntarily on their own, you end up with a pretty serious deadline, because if you go beyond that date and you haven't redeemed, that's when the tax buyer can file for the tax deed.
Okay, and then if they file for the tax deed, how does that work with the ownership of the property?
Well, then there are very good attorneys out there who are super specialized in attacking the tax deed process, and they're very successful sometimes too. They just dig right into every single little last thing that the tax buyer was required to do. And if they didn't do it all and they didn't cross every T and dot every I, the judges are looking for reasons to not kick someone out of their property, obviously. So that it can be attacked, but you do need a lawyer, definitely. And not me. I would not be the lawyer for that, but I do work closely with lawyers that do this work. And then if there's no protest and you don't contest the tax deed, eventually the tax deed does issue and it's recorded and everything's wiped out. The mortgages are wiped out, water bills, everything. The remaining area of contention is easements, whether there's an easement on the property, whether or not that gets wiped out and to what degree. So it seems like there's still case law coming out on that. Like every other year we see another tax deed easement case. Another one came out last week. I'm not totally sure what it says, but it's on my list of things to read. But it seems like that's the only unsettled part is to what extent can easements be extinguished by a tax deed? And then basically, like, now you own the property. So, you're the tax certificate holder who's now the tax deed holder. Now you're the owner of the property. You go to the property and you say, hi, do you want to occupy this property and sign a lease? Or do you want to move out? And if you don't want to do either of those things, I have to evict you. And then basically, you have to evict the person if they don't want to pay. So, and then another quirk that you see in some of the jurisdictions that have very bad tax enforcement in general, like they have property tax compliance problems. We were seeing that, let's say it was a commercial property and there was a roofing company occupying an industrial building and they were paying rent to a certain landlord, and the taxes remained unpaid, and property tax either went to annual sale or scavenger sale, either one. And now the new owner who takes title to the property goes to the property and says to the roofing company who's occupying the property, they say, hi, I'm your new landlord. You pay rent to me now. And then so what can happen in some of these jurisdictions where the tax compliance is so low is that the new owner can just take the rent. Let's say the rent is $6,000 a month, and put the rent in their pocket. And then, so they're getting $72,000 in the year, and maybe the taxes are 50 grand, and they're not paying the taxes. So this could go on for 3 years. You could end up getting $72,000 times 3 and not paying any of the taxes and not really caring, and just let the thing lapse back to the property tax sale again. And you're not allowed to buy your own taxes or pay your own taxes, pay your own delinquent taxes, as you can imagine. So there's rules against that, because that's shenanigans and illegal. But basically, that then the next landlord comes and knocks on the door and says to the roofing company, "Oh, well, you've been paying $6,000. Well, now you pay it to me." So you see, there was all this going on with these commercial properties. So there are some municipalities like Harvey that have gotten smart enough to say to the business runner, so the person who's running the business and occupying the building, they say, "Okay, if you want to do business in our municipality, you cannot be in a building that has delinquent taxes." So now they're tying business licenses to whether or not the property taxes are current, which I think is pretty smart. And if I were an elected official at the municipal level, I would be all for it.
Wow, that's such a crazy process. So like you said that the mortgage gets completely wiped out. So what happens to the person who issued the mortgage?
They get notices, so the property tax code, they're notified. But a lot of times what happens is, some of these places that have runaway local tax rates, the tax liability can escalate so quickly that, like I said before, like within 5 or 10 years, the tax liability itself can exceed the overall market value of the property.
Sure.
So sometimes the lender makes the calculated decision to not get involved and not pay the outstanding property taxes because the math doesn't work.
Are there situations where the unpaid taxes can be reduced or even forgiven or managed through a payment plan? Does that happen?
It used to be. I mean, this current administration who is in the assessor's office, they have not given CFEs on a couple of my cases that I pursued them on for, cases that would fit that fact pattern. But previous administrations they would consider doing what's called a certificate of error if the taxes were clearly an error. And a lot of times these delinquencies happen because nobody understood how to appeal or when to appeal. And it's too late once the property tax bill is issued. So, the previous 2-3 administrations, they did do certificates of error in cases like that, where it was really a problem of the property tax liability being very wildly incorrect. And that is how the property owner got into this position. Now it's almost impossible. I had some pretty meritorious cases that were denied in the last few years. And, once you have the bill in hand, it's 99% impossible to get it reduced. Unlike other jurisdictions, there are other jurisdictions when you see that bill, now it's time to appeal, but that's not how Illinois is. You have to appeal when you see the assessment notice, not when you see the bill.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. I did not know any of that, so that's very interesting. All right, well, that's it for today's episode of Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax. If you're worried about unpaid taxes or want to understand your rights in a tax enforcement situation, Nora and her team at the Devine Legal Group can definitely help you. Visit thedevinelawgroup.com to learn more, and be sure to like, subscribe, share the episode with someone who might need it. Fascinating stuff. I'm sure there's lots of people who could use the information out there. Nora, thank you so much for being here. Really enjoyed the conversation.
It's always good to see you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.